Hello, this time on Sitrep.
Greenland have been part of the Danish kingdom for 800 years.
We need Greenland for national security and even international security.
It is not for sale.
One way or the other, we're going to get it.
Why is Donald Trump squaring up against a Nato ally on a quest to take control of an island that is 80% covered with ice and has a smaller population than Hereford? Part of the answer, it's a key piece of a much bigger puzzle. The High North. The world's big military powers are all jockeying for position inside the Arctic Circle, so we're on a mission to explain the reasons why and the military might required to be part of this great power competition. We'll also hear from Norway, where it's about defending their own land and waters.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Well, it's easy to look at the High North and just see a frozen wasteland, but we don't have to look too far back in history, Mike, to see how important it is.
No, and it's been important for many centuries. The famous Northwest Passage between, the Pacific and the Atlantic, which never existed, of course, in modern history, was something that was looked for generations. I mean, Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake, they all looked for the Northwest Passage to try to. This is the obvious trade route between Asia and the Atlantic states in Europe, and of course it didn't exist, so they never found it. But now the Northwest Passage is beginning to exist, so it matters. There are minerals in the Arctic, and it's the transit route for ballistic missiles between Russia and the United States. They pass over the Arctic because that's the shortest distance between the two countries. So the map of the Arctic, as we're looking down from a globe, looking down with the Arctic in the center and all the countries in a circle around it, that sort of map, which most people are not really aware of, that sort of map is going to become very familiar to us, I think, in the years to come.
I'll explain that map in a little moment. The Trump presidency, though, has thrown a spotlight onto the 21st century competition for the High North. To help us understand what's going on, we've enlisted the services of Caroline Kennedy Pipe. She's Professor of War Studies at Loughborough University with a particular specialism in the Arctic. Caroline, welcome to Sitrep. Good to see you. What is driving the current outside interest in the High North?
The first point to add to the excellent analysis by Mike is that the Arctic is melting and melting fast. So although historically it was protected by ice, because of global warming, the sea routes across the Arctic, indeed the very important arterial route above Russia, the Northern Sea Route, is melting. Now, one still needs to be careful operating in the Arctic. It is not ice-free for most of the year, but increasingly we're beginning to see ice melt, rising waters, and here's the point. In the Arctic, the rare earth minerals which are necessary to any modern economy are becoming, it is now thinkable about seabed mining, and as Greenland, the ice sheet over Greenland melts, those rare earth minerals become more accessible. This explains American interest, Chinese interest, and of course Russian interest. So although it's too early to talk about an Arctic gold rush, people are eyeing these rare earth minerals the Chinese have tried to buy rights to mine in Greenland. And the Russians are extremely interested in what lies beneath the waters on the seabed. So we have geostrategic nuclear competition, military competition, but this very lucrative seabed mining, rare earth minerals. Greenland alone has 31 of the 34 rare earth minerals considered absolutely imperative to the next generation of technologies.
So, Caroline, can you just give us a quick geography lesson here? What does actually count as the High North? Is it simply everything inside the Arctic Circle, or is it a bit more complicated than that?
Of course, it's complicated. We academics like complicating things. So the Arctic is well defined. The High North is, in my view, more of a political geographic construction to incorporate the seas north of the UK. And indeed, we now talk of a wider Arctic to encompass the Baltics. So we're talking really, if you look at a map of the UK, going north into the European Arctic, encompassing Greenland, Iceland, Norway in particular, all the way up to Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago just south of the North Pole. This is an enormous space, and Greenland is the largest island in the world. We're talking about a maritime space predominantly, which these naval routes that are opening up, these trade routes, Northwest Passage, Northern Sea Route, are indispensable to getting into this space.
Well, if you look at a map, or more specifically a globe, you can really see the strategic picture unfold. Look down on the Arctic Circle with the North Pole in the middle. The Arctic Ocean effectively has two curved stretches of land around it, like a pair of brackets. On the left, you have Alaska, Canada and Greenland. On the right, it's almost all Russia, with Norway at the bottom. And of course, those countries all have territorial waters to go with those coastlines. There's a small gap at the top between Russia and Alaska leading through the Pacific. At the bottom, a larger gap between Greenland and Norway into the Atlantic and onto the UK and Europe. Mike, who wants access to those waters and why?
Well, the waters themselves will become more strategically important if the trade routes really do open up, as Caroline said. I mean, it looks with global warming as if they're almost certain to in the next couple of generations. Then that will be a really important trade route. But it also, of course, it's a strategically important route. For years, NATO and still worries about the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, the GEOC as it's called, which is the gap that Russian submarines have to get through in order to operate into the North Atlantic, that piece of water between Greenland, Iceland and the United Kingdom. And that will become, as it were, physically bigger, more accessible, and it is actually a very important strategic waterway, both militarily and economically.
Caroline, potentially limiting factors for navigational access are the territorial waters, which are fixed. The ice, which changes over time. How limited is the access now and how much is it changing?
So nobody owns the central Arctic Ocean. So you do have territorial waters and territorial reach, but you also have a space in which we've seen increasing numbers of Chinese fishing vessels. China has the largest deep sea water fleet in the world, and we've seen a constant renegotiation of territorial limits on, for example, fisheries. And Russia has negotiated with Faroe Islands and with Norway very recently about who can go where. So you're entirely right that fish, it might seem prosaic, but we in the UK fought two cod wars, of course. These tariffs and limits on who can fish what and where, absolutely crucial in the Arctic. Now, up until this point, the Russians have obeyed UNCLOS, that is the UN law of the sea. The Americans are not signatories, but they are willing to abide by it. UNCLOS has a very special clause, 234, which talks about ice waters. As the ice melts in the Arctic, there are questions about the legal regime and who will obey it and where it will apply. So things are changing, and changing quite fast in the Arctic in terms of these rights. Now, just to put this in context, the Russians have not more latterly questioned American interest in Greenland. They have in Svalbard, which is to the east. So if we're thinking geostrategically, I just throw this into the mix, I think that the Russians accept Greenland within a wider sphere of American interest, although they're quite willing to mischief make in terms of the politics. But in return, they will expect their authority over the Northern Sea Route and places like Svalbard, which is Norwegian, to be respected too. So I think we're seeing a great strategic game in which the Chinese really, at the moment, they are not suspected of anything in pure military terms in the Arctic, but they certainly have soft power aspirations.
And Mike, you mentioned earlier the submarines. How much of an issue is the ice for them?
Not so much an issue in terms of the ice packs themselves, but the submarines have got basically four routes. Russian submarines have got four routes to get through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, because the way they get through is by staying close to the seabed, where they're harder to pick out with sensors. And so there are, famously these 4 routes. Route 1 is the famous one, but there are 3 others. And submarines have to, as it were, navigate their way through. So shifting ice doesn't matter too much to the submarines, but it does matter to the ships and aircraft who need to operate above it to monitor where submarines are going. That's the essence of the issue, really.
And Mike, when NATO and others talk about the region being increasingly contested, what does that mean? How does that contest tangibly happen?
I think it happens in 2 ways, really. One is just greater military interest in the potential of operating in the high north and around the Arctic. And then the other, big strategic interest is that it will be more important to world politics. And so inevitably, states are taking just a greater interest in the very thin level of international law. As Caroline said, there are laws that control the Arctic and the high north, but they've never been very strong, not strong, they've never been very thick. It's been almost neglected in international law because nobody was really operating there. And now that people are beginning to operate there, the fact that the law is pretty thin and really hard to enforce is now becoming really important. And so the high north and the Arctic are now being subject to the great power politics that are getting a grip on everywhere else in the world. We never used to think too much about the high north. Now we have to think about it quite a lot.
And Caroline, you studied this area for quite some time now. What difference have you seen in the intensive nature of the contest? Have you seen a great intensification?
Yes, and Mike's entirely right that during the Cold War, it was an arena of nuclear competition and naval competition. But with the melt, what we're seeing both at the North Pole, but also at the South Pole, which is governed by a treaty, and it's important to note that the North Pole is not governed by a treaty. And so governance structures have tended to be ad hoc, based on harmony, bilateral and cooperative. So what we're now seeing as the Arctic melts is an uptick in military performance, so military exercises, very, very large shows of force by NATO and Western allies, and the Russians, despite their losses in Ukraine, investing very heavily across their northern Arctic regions. And you were quite right to point out earlier, Russia is the predominant Arctic power. You cannot act in the Arctic really without, for example, Russian icebreakers. And it's worth noting that in the UK we have one ice ship, HMS Protector. We don't have icebreakers. The Russians have over 55. The Americans have 2, one of which is out of service. So we're going to see, I think, an escalation and a race in who can build ice ships the fastest. And the Russians have, over the last few years, despite the war in Ukraine, invested very, very heavily in dual-purpose ships that can operate in these temperatures. And that's something that the Americans are looking at. So President Trump, has aspirations in Greenland governed by the 1951 treaty. But the Americans will need to invest heavily in icebreakers if they're serious about enhancing their position.
And Mike, how much military maritime activity in the Arctic is about that competition, and how much of it is about making use of the ocean for its practical purposes?
Well, at the moment, it's all about military competition in order to establish potential bases and influence and so on. We all know that the high north and the Arctic hasn't really begun to be exploited in an economic sense, but we all expect that to happen. So at the moment, it's all manoeuvring. It is this new Cold War that's opening up, cold in every respect, to allow countries that have a real interest in the Arctic and the high north to position themselves militarily. So I think everyone's gearing up for what they expect to be a very tough series of competitive problems in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s.
And what military resources do we need to put in to make that contest go the way we want, Caroline?
So that is the really important question that we're debating in UK defence. So the first point is, of course, the UK is not an Arctic state. We don't pretend to be. Now, with the American criticism under President Trump of NATO, many of us believe that it's time for the UK to do more in this region and area, to work with friends and allies, Norway, of course, the Dutch, to think about what capabilities. We have our Royal Marines, of course, we have our special forces, but really, and Mike is the expert on this, many of us believe that having only one ice-class ship, which spends most of the year at the South Pole in Antarctica, we need to invest more heavily in capabilities. Again, the Russians are investing, and they've also developed an Arctic drone fleet, which is extremely interesting in terms of operating still in these extremely treacherous conditions. If you look at the American investment in their base on Greenland, they have just awarded a contract, a joint American Greenlandic contract, to reinvigorate and service their military base on Greenland. And that is worth billions of dollars, because operating in these environments is so hard, so tough. Minus 20, minus 29.
In terms of our strategic thinking, it does raise this issue about the concentration of the Navy. I know that the Chief of the Defence Staff, is a naval officer, and he always talks about our ability to go up into the high north and to operate, and not to leave it all to the Russians. But the fact is, we invested in carriers, and our aircraft carriers really play a different role. They play a more global role, and we can argue about whether that's a good or a bad thing. But the fact is, we can choose to withdraw from east of Suez. We can choose to withdraw from our interest in the Middle East, but we can't withdraw from the Arctic. We can't withdraw from the North Atlantic. And this sense that we've got to concentrate now on our Atlantic security probably reinforces the arguments or the problem of, well, do we have the right equipment to do that? Sending aircraft carriers up into the high north is not a clever idea by and large. You need different sorts of ships. You need frigates and submarines. And so, we may have invested in the things which take us away from an Arctic role. And if we're serious about it, then we've got to reinvest in the sort of naval assets and some of the air assets that we might need.
Well, that is the big picture. Let's look at a couple of countries in detail now, starting with Greenland, because Donald Trump is talking about it. And Vice President J.D. Vance flew 2,500 miles there to visit America's existing military base and its 150 US Air and Space Force personnel.
I want to thank our Guardians, our airmen, and everyone else for the warm reception in a very, very cold place. I think it's probably the coldest place I've ever been. The mission that you guys do is so important for the United States. It's important for our national security. USA! USA! I think a lot of Americans wonder, why does Greenland matter so much? Why does the mission of this base matter so much to the American people? If a missile was fired from an enemy country or an enemy submarine into the United States, it is the people here before us who would give notice to our brave men and women further south in the United States to let people know what was coming, and God willing to try to shoot it down and prepare for it. That's one of the things that we do at installations like this. We know that Russia and China and other nations are taking an extraordinary interest in Arctic passageways and Arctic naval routes, and indeed in the minerals of the Arctic territories. We need to ensure that America is leading in the Arctic, because we know that if America doesn't, other nations will fill the gap where we fall behind. Our message to Denmark is very simple. You have not done a good job by the people of Greenland. You have underinvested in the people of Greenland, and you have underinvested in the security architecture of this incredible, beautiful landmass filled with incredible people. That has to change. And because it hasn't changed, this is why President Trump's policy in Greenland is what it is.
J.D. Vance setting out his case for why Greenland militarily matters for the US and even for world security. But he was speaking from a US military base that is doing that job, and it's a US base on NATO territory. Mike, could the US make good use of greater military presence in Greenland?
Yes, it could, as could NATO as a whole. I mean, J.D. Vance, never want to miss an opportunity to insult an ally, put it all on Greenland. But the fact is that the treaty that we've already mentioned, the Danish-American Treaty of 1951, gives the Americans the right to do whatever they need to do in Greenland. For those who like reading international treaties late at night, you can look at Article 3B of the 1951 treaty. It lists about 7 hold-all categories that the US can build bases, can build roads, can establish whatever it wants. It has sovereignty on those bases. It can do whatever it likes to do according to the 1951 treaty. So it doesn't need any other control over Greenland. If they want to take it more seriously, they can do so. It's all there.
So taking all of that into account, Caroline, the suspicion for a lot of people is that the US is only interested in what it could drill and dig up in Greenland. What's your take on that?
I think that there is an element of truth because President Trump believes in the commodification of diplomacy. We've seen that with the would-be deals with Ukraine, and certainly the Americans would be extremely interested in what lies beneath the ice on Greenland. But there's something else here in terms of Trump's foreign policy. For many years, the Americans ignored Greenland, maintained the base, but had very little interest. I think it was when China started asserting its interest in Greenland around 2017, 2018, that it dawned on the Americans that there was something very interesting happening in Greenland. So the Chinese, for example, offered to build a new runway just outside Nuuk and were rebuffed by the Americans and the Danes, who worked in conjunction on that. But where J.D. Vance, whatever one thinks of him, had a point in that speech, is that the Kingdom of Denmark did, on a routine basis, neglect the indigenous people of Greenland in a manner that, in a post-colonial nation like Britain, we know all about. So the indigenous people of Greenland have begun to become increasingly nationalistic, and that has been recognised both in Copenhagen and, perhaps Vance is right, belatedly. A series of scandals over the treatment of indigenous women on Greenland, the indigenous population, the orphanage scandal of what was happening to young indigenous children. All of that leaves a very bitter taste for many in the nationalistic community on Greenland. Now, the Kingdom of Denmark is rapidly trying to make good that troubled past. But the question is really for Greenlandic nationalists, is it too little, too late? And I think the Danes are going to have to scramble now. We've seen the foreign minister there very recently. But the American interest is profound. And as Mike said, that 1951 treaty gives them much of what they want. And the American Coast Guard works closely with the Coast Guards of the Arctic states. But I think it's a balancing act now, and the Greenlandic nationalists will, I think, play this card very well.
And that American interest in Greenland, Mike, it's not a good look. One NATO ally demanding territory from another. How damaging is it?
It would be very damaging indeed if America took unilateral action. Again, I go back to the 1951 treaty. I mean, the preamble is all written in terms of collective security and the mutual interests of Denmark and the United States in relation to Greenland. And it talks about the treaty is all for NATO access. The whole treaty is set up as a benefit to NATO and a mutual benefit to the United States and Denmark with an enormous free hand for the United States. I mean, the US doesn't have to do anything other than offer due respect to the sovereignty of Denmark, and it offers due respect to the native peoples, the Inuits. And so, in a way, the treaty itself is a NATO treaty. And if the United States, as it were, ripped up its own treaty and moved into Denmark in some precipitate way, it would be a huge, huge blow to NATO. I mean, I'm not sure NATO would survive it, to be honest, to have its most important power, as it were, invading the territory of another of its members.
Does Donald Trump really think he can get Greenland, though, or is it just an opening gambit for some kind of compromise?
I think the US Defense Department knows what Greenland offers, and as Caroline says, is taking it much more seriously in the last few years. And I think, Britain has been more alive to this much earlier, to the whole high North Arctic issue, than the United States was. But I'm absolutely convinced that Trump's interest is grandeur. I mean, he can have everything he wants from the situation as it now is. But what he can't have, unless he changes it unilaterally, is to have Greenland coloured the same colour on a map as the United States. And he looks at the US, 40% of the US landmass, 40% of the present United States was purchased or acquired from somebody else. So, Louisiana from France, from parts of California, from Spain, Alaska from Russia. So it doesn't seem odd to Donald Trump that they should acquire another piece of territory. But what he really wants is the grandeur of extending the territory of the United States. I mean, he argues about it strategically, but he thinks about it in a very personalised way.
And Caroline, Donald Trump also likes talking about Canada. Given how much of its coastline is in the high north, how much military effort and capability are they putting in?
So again, it's a very interesting story, and Mike's quite right. We in the UK from about 2010, 2011 began to think very seriously about the high north, not least because of our energy reliance on Norway. So the Americans have come to this much later, I think, in terms of their interest and strategic capabilities. Canada, too, was noticeably silent on Arctic affairs, despite being one of the dominant players. Now, remember, Canada and the United States have ongoing disagreements over the Northwest Passage. And so we need to take that into account. But Canada has, in my view, punched well below its weight in terms of Arctic affairs. But more latterly, it has been scrambling to become involved again. So in a sense, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, more recent illegal invasion of Ukraine, I think suddenly startled, the United States and Canada into thinking about the way the Russians view the Arctic. Now, Ukraine is important to people like President Putin and those around him because they see it as forming a geopolitical heartland for Russia. But they also believe that further north, and particularly in the Russian Arctic and European Arctic.
Well, let's get the perspective now from another NATO ally, which very much has skin in the game. Around a third of Norway's territory and 10% of its population are in the Arctic, and it has around 58,000 square miles of Arctic waters. That Norwegian territory includes the Svalbard archipelago, with its largest island, Spitsbergen, reaching almost as far north as Greenland. I've been talking to Tormod Heier, who served in Norway's armed forces for 32 years and is now a professor at the Norwegian Defence Command and Staff College. Why does he think the rest of the world is so interested in the High North right now?
Well, I think that is because Russia has its most important foreign policy instrument. Its 7 nuclear strategic submarines situated on the Kola Peninsula. That is part of Russia's Northern Fleet, the most important fleet that Russia possesses. And inside these 7 strategic submarines, they have these nuclear missiles. And due to the chroming of the Earth, the shortest trajectory line for these missiles goes from Kola Peninsula across the Spitsbergen and Greenland and over to the eastern coast of the United States. So if there is a crisis between the United States and Russia, these weapons just a few miles away from the Norwegian border will have a key role in Russia's way to manage such a crisis.
And how much of a threat do you feel from the likes of Russia and China in the High North?
Today, I would say that Russia's military force in the High North is not very significant. It was much, much bigger some years ago before the Ukraine war started. But since 2014 and the Crimean annexation, particularly US forces, but also other NATO forces, has gradually pushed Russia's Northern Fleet into the eastern part of the Barents Sea region. And in terms of China, they do not have much military hardware in the Arctic. So they do not at all pose any military threat in this region.
So in terms of Norwegian territory, do you not feel there is much military activity from either Russia or China in your specific area?
Nothing from China, and the military activity from Russian side is very reduced. And that is mainly because Russia has been occupied in a war of attrition in Europe's second largest state. So even though you have the Northern Fleet operating out from the Kola Peninsula, they are also affected by Russia's war in Ukraine. So the operativity in the Northern Fleet, I would say, is not as strong as it used to be before the war.
So how much of Norway's military effort does the region take up?
It takes up most of it, because any crisis with the world's largest state, Russia, will, as seen from a Norwegian perspective, be perceived as some kind of an existential threat. So the majority of the Norwegian force is focused on the Barents Sea region, the Finnmark county, which is bordering Russia's 196 kilometer long border. But on the other hand, Norway doesn't have much military force either, due to so many decades with international operations and so much underfunding of the Norwegian force. So in a way, Norwegian government doesn't have much leeway or room for maneuver in this region, which means that the dependency on US forces is extremely high these days.
And to that point, how much support does Norway get from NATO, and does it do enough?
Well, I think there's always a struggle inside NATO in order to get as much attention as possible towards one's own region. And Norway is struggling constantly to get as much attention as possible. And within NATO, we have a special relationship between Norway and the United States. And that is because Norway is extremely important for US homeland security. And that is because we are situated only 40 kilometers from some of the world's most sophisticated nuclear forces, and they can be used against the United States if there is a crisis occurring on the horizon between these two nuclear superpowers, Russia and the United States. So Norway is from Washington perceived as an early warning station that in a way tries to, as much as possible, keep control with Russia's nuclear force on the Kola Peninsula.
And how are you in Norway now feeling about the US interest in the region, and in particular in Greenland?
Well, there are some speculations in Norway as well. Will Putin and Trump, in a way, divide the Arctic into two spheres of influence, where the United States gets Greenland and Russia gets more control over Spitsbergen on the western part of Arctic, as seen from Moscow? But on the other hand, the probability for that kind of division, I think, is very low. And the reason for that is that, as seen from a US perspective, it will be completely unacceptable that Spitsbergen, the high north, the Barents Sea region will become some kind of a black hole that is completely dominated by Russia, because this is the exact point where Russia's nuclear forces operate from on the maritime side.
And you mentioned Spitsbergen. Can you just tell us a bit more about it, its significance and its status?
Well, Spitsbergen is part of the Norwegian territory, but Norway has to be very cautious in the way that we are managing the rules and the laws on that island group, because according to the treaty from 1920, all the other signatory states, like Russia or China or Britain, for that sake's kind, should be, in a way, allowed to have the same rights when it comes to do commercial activities. So this is a vulnerable, or maybe a weak spot in the bilateral relationship between Norway and Russia, because the way Norway manages its rules and its enforcement of its rules on this island can easily be exploited by the Kremlin if they want to invoke some kind of a crisis that can put this very fragile bilateral relationship in a more tense situation.
What kind of crisis do you mean?
Well, you know, it could be seen as a way from the Russians to provoke a further crisis in order to legitimize more military involvement on the Spitsbergen Islands, as maybe some kind of a reaction to the Trump administration's more assertive policy in the Greenland part of the Arctic. But on the other hand, this should not be over-dramatized either, because the Norwegian government has generations with experience on how to balance Russia in these matters.
And just to be clear, it can't be used by anyone as a military base.
No, that's true. It is quite demilitarized, I would say. And that has been a strong Norwegian consistent policy for generations in order to keep some kind of a low tension in this region and not giving Russia any incentives to escalate the situation into some kind of a bilateral rivalry where little Norway will always be the inferior part vis-a-vis Russia.
Tormod Heier, really good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mike, Tormod seemed relatively relaxed there about at least the immediate challenges facing Norway in the High North.
Yes, he was a remarkably cheerful Norwegian. You always need a good Norwegian voice when things are desperate. And he was relatively relaxed about the situation as at present, but he's got a very clear view of what the challenges are that lie ahead. And I don't think there's any way of dodging those challenges because of all the things we've talked about so far in the programme. There's an awful lot of things coming down the road at us. I hope we can meet them with the same degree of equanimity that he showed in that interview.
Yes, and Caroline, you know Svalbard well. You mentioned its strategic position earlier. Do you think Russia has designs on this Norwegian territory?
Yes, of course. But to be clear, the treaty which awarded the archipelago to Norway was the result of manoeuvring at the Versailles Conference, which ended World War I. Neither the Russians nor the Chinese, of course, were present at Versailles, but they later became signatories to that treaty. Intriguingly, in the Russian press, that treaty has now been questioned. Norwegian sovereignty has again been highlighted as coming out of a very unfair settlement at the end of World War I. The Russians have two settlements on the archipelago, both of which were purchased, coming back to Mike's earlier point about how great powers purchase territories. Both were mining communities. And right up to the end of the 1990s were significant communities which were footholds in Nato territory. And as such, we use particularly Pyramiden and the other settlement, Barentsburg, as a showcase for all that was good about Soviet socialism. Really quite extraordinary settlements, and one self-sufficient. Barentsburg and Pyramiden fell into the doldrums in the late 1990s for financial reasons, but have been reinvigorated. And Barentsburg in particular has a helipad, and Svalbard is not technically demilitarized, but the treaty does not allow for permanent military fortifications. However, the allegations by the Russians is that in the airport in Longyearbyen, the capital of Svalbard, that there have been military transits by NATO, and NATO has also alleged, and it's true, that Chechen militias were moved through Longyearbyen airport for a training exercise in the north. The listening stations on Svalbard are widely disliked by the Russians, as are the satellite capabilities. And so we have, as we did over the NATO radar on the Faroe Islands, have a particular ding-dong about who is doing what, both in Svalbard but also on the Faroe Islands. Where our Norwegian colleague was cheerfully correct is that the Norwegians have a long track record in successfully managing the Russians in and around Svalbard. But the Russians have made it clear, they've reinforced, and they're reopening Pyramiden with a joint university with the Chinese there. So there is much greater interest. And of course, technically, the only university that can operate on Svalbard is the Norwegian run one in the capital. But here, let me make a point. The crisis might not be overtly military, but the game is a scientific endeavour. So to be an Arctic player, any state has to have Arctic science credentials, a history of exploration and of science. And what the Chinese are doing, if we look at the research station on Svalbard, they are there. So are the Indians. You cannot stop signatories acting in a certain way. And the same is also true at the South Pole, where new research stations have been opened. So I would expect there to be what we might call soft power competition in science, which is certainly ongoing. And then, of course, space will be crucial. And note again, our Norwegian cheerful Mike said, quite right, that as yet the Chinese have not invoked anything militarily. But the big question is who is responsible for the attacks on the critical infrastructure running through the high north and the cutting of underwater cables, for example.
That is absolutely fascinating. I think there's going to be a whole episode at some point about soft power through scientific research. That's a really interesting point you made. You are off to Svalbard again in a few weeks. What will you be doing there?
So I don't know how you feel about certain places in the world. It has its own magic and its own allure. The history is fascinating, including the role of the British during World War II. It's a very specific community, very small community, extremely beautiful. But our particular project this time is to go and talk to representatives of the Governor's Office, which runs Svalbard, and try and find out a bit more about the politics from the ground up, the people who actually live and work there. And again, Norway has learnt the hard way that what used to be a mining town, this was a mining community, has had to be transformed into something rather more democratic. It was a company town. And now local people, quite rightly, there is no indigenous population, by the way, have begun to demand greater democratization, if we can call it that. So it's a special place. And, I've never seen a polar bear while I've been there. That's always a wish. But it's a fascinating small community that really withstood the tensions of the Cold War. But I think increasingly will be the focus of Russian attention.
Mike, a final thought. We have war in Europe, potential threats from places like North Korea and Iran. How much of our military time, effort and resource can we offer to the competition for the High North? And is it enough?
Well, it's a story of our times, really, that in principle, the British military has a little bit of everything it needs, but only a little bit of it. So, we have aircraft that fly out of Lossiemouth that can look after some of the airspace. We have a navy that can get up there. It's got the right sort of ships, but not enough of them. We've got a ground force. The Marines train in the Arctic North. So we've got a little bit of everything, but not enough of anything to make a difference to what really goes on there. And there's some historical basis for that. Caroline mentioned the polar bears in Svalbard. A few years ago, around about, I think it was 2010, 2011, I had a conversation with Walt Natanchik, who was the chief of the defence staff of Canada. And he told me that the few Canadian troops that they had looking after their northern Arctic border, not many troops, they absolutely insisted that they had to be armed with the Lee Enfield 303, the old rifle first designed in 1907 that our grandfathers used in the First World War, that my father used in the Second World War. They sourced parts on the internet to keep their stock going. And they insisted they would only go out with a Lee Enfield 303. Why? Because it was the only rifle at the time that they trusted that under any conditions would stop a charging polar bear at 50 metres.
Excellent and lovely thought to end on. Mike, thank you very much. Professor Caroline Kennedy-Pipe, great to see you today. That is all from Professor Michael Clarke and I. We'll be back next Thursday with another Sitrep. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.